There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when something unexpected crosses a line, not the comfortable quiet of a pause between jokes, but the kind that makes people look at each other uncertainly, wondering if what they just witnessed was real. That silence fell over a television studio audience in October of 1956, and its echo would effectively end one of the most celebrated programs in American broadcasting history. The Honeymooners, a show built on laughter, on working-class grit, and on the raw chemistry of two of television's finest performers, came undone not through low ratings or network scheming, though both played their parts, but through a single unscripted moment that revealed something nobody in that studio, or in the millions of living rooms watching across America, was prepared to see. To understand how that moment came to be, you have to understand the world that produced it and the man at the center of it. Jackie Gleason was not a performer who found his material in books or acting classes. He found it in the streets of Brooklyn, in the tenements and pool halls and cramped apartments, where he spent his youth navigating a world that offered very little in the way of comfort or security. His father walked out when Jackie was just 9 years old, and that abandonment left a mark that never fully healed. What it left behind instead was a surplus of hunger for success, for recognition, for the kind of life his childhood had made impossible to imagine. By the early 1950s, Gleason had found his way to television through sheer force of personality. His show on the Dumont Network, Cavalcade of Stars, gave him a platform, and it was there that Ralph Kramden first emerged, a Brooklyn bus driver with outsized dreams, a volcanic temper, and a fundamental inability to stop believing that the next scheme, the next idea, the next shortcut would be the one that finally changed everything. Ralph was not a sanitized television protagonist. He was loud. He was wrong more often than he was right, and he was genuinely difficult to live with. He was also, unmistakably, real. What made the character resonate so deeply was precisely what made him uncomfortable. American television in the early 1950s was populated almost exclusively with idealized versions of family life fathers who dispensed wisdom from armchairs, mothers who smiled through every inconvenience, children who learned tidy lessons before the closing credits. Ralph Kramden fit none of those templates. He lived in a small apartment with peeling walls. He had no savings and too many ambitions. He argued with his wife, not as a comic device, but as a genuine reflection of what life looked like when two stubborn people were stuck together in a tight space with not enough money. The show's move to CBS in 1955, where it became a standalone series separate from the variety format, gave it a tighter focus and a more consistent identity. 39 original episodes were produced, filmed before a live studio audience, without the safety net of retakes or editing. Every performance was final. Every improvisation stayed in. That format was both the source of the show's electricity and the condition that made its most dangerous moment possible. The character of Alice Kramden was, in many ways, the structural load-bearing wall of the entire program. Without Alice, Ralph's bluster had nothing to push against. She was the fixed point around which his chaos revolved, calm, where he was frantic, precise, where he was grandiose, quietly devastating where he was merely loud. She was not a victim, and she was not a sidekick. She was, in the eyes of many who study the show closely, the smarter of the two, and she knew it, even when tact required her not to say so directly. Audrey Meadows, who eventually defined the role for most viewers, almost never got the chance. When she first auditioned, CBS executives rejected her on the grounds that she was too attractive, too polished, too far removed from the working-class reality the character was meant to represent. Meadows took the rejection not as a final answer, but as a direction. She returned for a second attempt with a set of photographs, rather than a formal audition photographs, taken in a plain house dress, with her hair pulled back and no makeup, in natural light in an ordinary kitchen. The woman in those photographs looked like a woman who had been calculating the grocery budget every week for 20 years. Gleason took one look at them and understood immediately. She was Alice. What Meadows brought to the role was a quality that proved more durable than any specific line reading. She made you believe Alice had a full interior life that the camera was only occasionally glimpsing. When Ralph delivered one of his threats, the bombastic declarations that he was sending her to the moon or variations on that same explosive warning Meadows rarely matched his volume. She would look at him with an expression that communicated, simultaneously, complete exasperation, lingering affection, and an unshakable certainty that she had seen this particular episode of Ralph many times before and knew exactly how it ended. That look was funnier than any line could have been, and it recontextualized Ralph's rage as something that existed inside a long and complicated marriage rather than as something dangerous. That recontextualization was fragile. It depended on Gleason playing his part with a particular kind of comic exaggeration, a performance so obviously theatrical that no reasonable viewer could confuse it with anything real. For most of the show's run, he delivered exactly that, and then came October 1956. The episode in question was titled The Deciding Vote. On paper, it was entirely characteristic of the show. Ralph becomes convinced that his single vote in a local election carries decisive weight, which leads to a series of increasingly convoluted misunderstandings and eventual humiliation. The premise was clever, the setup was efficient, and the live studio audience had arrived ready for the kind of sharp, high-energy comedy the program reliably delivered. For most of the episode, that is precisely what they received. Gleason was in exceptional form, quick on his feet, feeding off the audience's energy, stretching moments with the confidence of a performer who understood exactly how much space a joke could occupy before it needed to resolve. The cast was locked in, the pacing was right, and everything pointed toward a standard issue, Honeymooners triumph. Then came the exchange that nobody in the building had fully anticipated. In the midst of a heated back and forth between Ralph and Alice, Gleason delivered the line that had become, over the course of the series, its most famous recurring element. "Bang! Zoom! Straight to the moon, Alice!" It was a line the audience knew by heart, a line they had been conditioned to receive as a harmless absurdity, the verbal equivalent of a cartoon character's wild swing that always missed and always ended in a pratfall. But this time, the delivery was different. The theatricality was gone. The comic exaggeration, the quality that signaled to every viewer that what they were witnessing was performance rather than threat, had simply vanished. Gleason's voice dropped into a register that was quieter, and for that reason, far more unsettling than his usual bellow. His posture changed. The physical distance between him and Meadows contracted in a way that was not staged, and not funny. The line landed not as a punchline but as something else entirely, something that the audience in that studio, and the estimated 60 million viewers watching at home, did not have a comfortable framework for processing. The laughter did not come. In its place was a silence that several crew members, speaking privately in the years that followed, described as one of the most uncomfortable moments they had ever experienced in a television studio. For a program built on the reliable rhythms of live comedy setup, escalation, release, the absence of that release was genuinely disorienting. What had always been the show's most reliably explosive moment had somehow transformed, through nothing more than a shift in tone and intention, into something that felt threatening rather than comedic. Behind the scenes, the fallout was rapid and largely invisible to the public. CBS had, in truth, been watching the show's metrics with increasing concern for several weeks before that October broadcast. Ratings remained respectable, but had dipped noticeably from their earlier peaks. More critically, sponsors, the entities whose comfort determined more about television programming decisions in the 1950s than any creative consideration, had been registering discomfort with what several of them described as the show's rougher edges. The economics of commercial television in that era were brutally simple. A sponsor who withdrew support did not merely cost a program revenue, it sent a signal that the program was commercially toxic, which was often enough to trigger a cascade of other withdrawals. For a network operating in the still early years of a medium that had not yet established its own stable institutional identity, the prospect of a sponsor crisis over content was genuinely alarming. The scene in the deciding vote did not cause those concerns, it crystallized them. It gave the network and the sponsors a specific, concrete instance they could point to when discussing why the program required either significant modification or removal. The letters that arrived at the CBS offices in the days following the broadcast were not uniformly negative. Plenty of viewers wrote to express continued enthusiasm for the show, but the ones that expressed unease were precisely the kind that made network executives anxious. They suggested that the careful fiction of harmlessness, which the show had always depended on to make its edgier material palatable, was no longer functioning reliably. The decision that followed was made quietly, without announcement, and without the fanfare that might have allowed viewers to prepare. There was no farewell episode. There was no statement from the network acknowledging what was happening or why. One week the show was on the air, and the next week it was not, and the millions of people who had built it into their Friday evening routines were left to speculate about the reasons. For Gleason, the end of the original series was a wound that took years to properly understand. Ralph Kramden was not simply a professional achievement, he was in some fundamental sense a reckoning with everything that had shaped Gleason's own life. The hunger, the grandiosity, the explosive frustration of a man who believed he was capable of more than his circumstances permitted. None of that was invention. Gleason had lived alongside those feelings for as long as he could remember, and the character had given him a way to examine them at a remove, through the protective distance of comedy. To lose the platform on which that examination was possible was to lose something that mattered to him in a way that went beyond professional disappointment. Friends who knew him well during that period described a man who took the cancellation personally, who felt it not merely as a commercial setback, but as a judgment about the quality and value of what he had created. The fact that the judgment had been rendered without public acknowledgement through the quiet mechanism of sponsor pressure and network calculation made it harder rather than easier to process. What Gleason did next was unusual for the era. Rather than moving on and treating the characters as another chapter in a long career, he negotiated to retain the rights to Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton, a business decision that kept him in control of the characters' future and allowed him to revisit them on his own terms in the years that followed. Throughout the 1960s and into subsequent decades, the characters reappeared in sketch formats on his variety programs, and audiences responded with genuine warmth whenever they did. The chemistry was real and enduring. But the urgency, the particular electric quality that had made those original 39 episodes feel genuinely alive, was more difficult to reconstruct than Gleason had perhaps imagined. The conditions that had produced it, the live format, the unedited performances, the constant creative tension of working without a safety net were gone, and their absence left a perceptible hollowness that no amount of effort could fully disguise. The question that has occupied scholars of television history in the decades since is not simply what happened in that studio in October 1956, but what it revealed about the show that had been running for years before it. The Honeymooners had always operated in territory that its contemporaries preferred to avoid, the territory of marital friction, economic anxiety, and the gap between aspiration and reality. It had made that territory accessible and funny through a set of carefully maintained conventions, the most important of which was the understanding that Ralph's threats were theatrical rather than real. What the scene in the deciding vote exposed was how thin the line between those two categories actually was. The difference between a comedic threat and a genuine one is almost entirely a matter of delivery of tone, of body language, of the subtle signals that tell an audience whether they are watching performance or witnessing something else. When those signals changed, even briefly, even perhaps unintentionally, the entire architecture of the show's relationship with its audience changed with them. That architecture was not rebuilt after that night. The show ended, and the moment became one of those television episodes that exists largely in the testimony of those who witnessed it, referenced occasionally in critical analyses of the period, but never fully documented or officially acknowledged by the network that pulled the plug. The absence of official documentation is, in its own way, telling. Networks in the 1950s were not accustomed to explaining themselves, particularly when the explanation involved admitting that a program had been cancelled in response to a single broadcast moment that crossed a line too subtle to articulate in a press release. In the years and decades that followed the original run's end, something remarkable happened to the Honeymooners that nobody involved in its production had reason to anticipate. The show's cultural standing grew steadily, and the qualities that had made it uncomfortable, its refusal to romanticize working-class life, its willingness to show a marriage as something complicated and argumentative and still fundamentally loving, came to be understood not as liabilities, but as the precise things that made it valuable. The 39 original episodes became touchstones for television writers and performers who came after. The influence of the show on All in the Family, on Roseanne, on the broader tradition of working-class comedy that runs through American television, is not a matter of critical speculation. It is acknowledged directly by many of the creators who built those later programs. The template that Gleason and his collaborators established almost by accident, and certainly against the preferences of the network suits who were always slightly uncomfortable with it, became one of the defining structures of the medium. Ralph Kramden's particular combination of bombast and vulnerability, his genuine belief in himself coexisting with an equally genuine inability to get out of his own way, provided the emotional architecture for a long line of television characters who followed him. Archie Bunker owed him a debt. Homer Simpson owed him a debt. Every television character who has been simultaneously infuriating and deeply sympathetic, who has made audiences laugh at their failures while still caring whether they succeeded, has Ralph Kramden somewhere in their lineage. The infamous scene that prompted the show's quiet cancellation is, in retrospect, inseparable from everything that made the program worth preserving. The show worked because it was willing to take the risk of being real, and it ended because that risk, on one particular October evening, produced something more real than anyone had bargained for. Television, like all popular art, has a complicated relationship with the truth. It claims to represent, it wants the appearance of authenticity without the discomfort of actual honesty. For 39 episodes, the Honeymooners managed to give audiences both. On the night it could no longer maintain that balance, the silence in the studio said everything that needed to be said.